good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whenever you're watching. I hope that you are having a blessed day. Welcome back to Romans 8:28 Publishing, where we are with another word alive, not just a word that is alive, because we know God's word is alive, but a word that will make you alive, a word that will bring more life to your life, a word that will bring you that abundant life, that word that will allow you to live and not just be alive. And we are back here. I'm so grateful for everybody who's been tuning in. We are here in our first series since we came back on, the recipe for the legendary victory, something we all seek, something we all strive for, that legendary victory. We're giving you the recipe for it right now. And we're going to be coming from that great story. Many are familiar with it from 1 Samuel chapter 17. Yes, that story of David and Goliath, the little man against the giant, the newcomer that had never been trained in battle against the veteran of the battlefield. And yet we know who comes out ahead in the end. We're going to be coming tonight from verses 38 through 40. Verses 38 through 40 of 1 Samuel chapter 17. And we're going to be, the topic for our lesson tonight is to bring the weapons you trained with. That's right, bring the weapons you trained with. Because sometimes we're using one weapon all the time, and then when the big battle comes, we all of a sudden try and switch out weapons. And we're going to see how bringing that weapon that you train with can help you get smoothly to that legendary victory. This series actually started with one lesson, and we haven't even gotten to that one yet. But yet, what was great about this is the more I prepared for that one, the more God revealed to me about this recipe for the legendary victory. This victory that we can have, and we can have smoothly and more robust victories if we not only learn these principles that we're talking about, but the important thing is we've got to live by them. Just hearing them isn't going to make the difference. But if you live by the principles that we're talking about in these lessons, I promise you that your victories will be swifter and more decisive. We're saved, so we know we have the victory, but we know there's a lot of battles in the middle there, that we want those swift, decisive victories, and that can glorify God, that can save our children, our nieces, our nephews, our neighbors, our friends, our coworkers, everybody that we come in contact with. And I'm going to just recap here a little bit about what we've been talking about so far. So far we've been talking about the one key that I said I want everybody to take from this is to understand the legendary victory is not won on the day of the battle. About 80% of your legendary victory is actually achieved before you even know who your enemy is. Then there's about 10% more that comes down to, once you know who that enemy is, preparing specifically for that enemy in the way that God would have you. So the key is this. It's what you do today that determines the outcome of the battle tomorrow. It's not what you do on that day in the battlefield, because if you haven't been preparing beforehand, you're not going to be equipped to handle what we're going to learn about in our first lesson, which is that formidable opponent. That's right. Our first lesson, we learned that every legendary victory needs a formidable opponent. There's never been a senior in high school who got a pat on the back and a how do you do over beating up a kindergartner. There's no legendary victory. You're just a bully if you're beating up on the kindergartner and you're a senior in high school. But when you have an opponent who can put a little bit of fear in you, an opponent who you can look at and push you to your limits in order to get the victory, that's where the legendary victory becomes now good, fertile ground for that victory. And so I tell you this, not that you should go out and seek a formidable opponent, but I tell you this for this reason, because God has legendary victories for His children. So as a child of God, you're going to have legendary victories, which means what? You've got to face some formidable opponents. So when you face that illness, when you face that financial problem, when you face that problem with your children, your parents, whoever it is, and you go, that just looks too big for me, don't be discouraged. That's just God setting you up for the legendary victory. And then after that, we went on to lesson number 2. And in lesson number 2, we learned a very important lesson, and one that kind of goes hand in hand with tonight's lesson. And that is, you You play how you practice. I had a soccer coach in high school who used to tell us that. He'd say, if you're practicing sloppy every day, you're going to play sloppy in the game. If you're not hustling in practice, you're not going to hustle in the game. If you're a ball hog in practice all season long, you're not going to get into that big game at the end of the season and all of a sudden be a willing passer, right? You play how you practice. So the thing is, our lives, most of our lives are not legendary battles and big opponents and legendary victories. Most of our lives are just day to day, earning a living, taking care of our families, sharing the good news of the gospel, taking care of our parents when they get into older years. Just that day to day is really what 90% of our life is, right? So it's these times when you're just going through the day to day life. How do you conduct yourself in the day-to-day life? What tools are you using to get through the day-to-day life? Are you using a drink to relax, or are you using prayer to relax? Are you celebrating with a bottle of scotch, or are you celebrating by praising God and thanking Him, right? So it's how you handle yourself in these day-to-day, that day-to-day practice, that when you get into the battle, that's where your reflex, that's where your muscle memory is going to be, in those things that you did day to day. And then we went on to lesson number 3. Lesson number 3, we learned that it does matter how you get into the fight. And we looked at, in the story of David and Goliath, we saw that David ended up on the battlefield. How? Because he was being obedient to what his father told him to do. His father gave him very specific instructions, and David followed them to the T, and he didn't move on to the next thing until he had accomplished what his father had given him to do. So we see here that it matters when you're getting into the battle, because you've been obedient to God. We can count on the fact that He's already gone before us, and we're going to have a swift and a decisive victory. But when we get in there because we disobeyed, because we went our own way, that's when we can get into those battles that drain us, those battles that take us off our path, and we've got to now work our way back to where God had for us to be. And then in lesson number 4, we went into, I love this one, you're going to love the titles, you've got to learn to overcome your allies, right? Because in lesson number 4, David finally found out who his opponent was going to be, and when he started talking to people about this opponent, all of a sudden people started chiming in. And you know what? It wasn't his enemies that were trying to keep him from getting that legendary victories. It was his brother. It was the king who he was wanting to go for that were trying to keep him from those legendary victories. So in the 4th one, we talked about how to handle those people that try to keep you from getting into your life, those people that you call friend, those people that you call brother, sister, that you call coworker, that you think have got your back. Sometimes they can be the ones to take you off track, and we looked at how to handle those people when they try to derail you before you even get to the battlefield. So I just want to encourage you in that, and that's where we're going to pick up now with lesson number 5. What happened as we were reading the scriptures at the end of lesson number 4 was David had found out about Goliath. And David is talking to King Saul about the fact that he wants to go out and fight Goliath, and Saul initially was like, no, he's too big, he's too strong, he's too experienced, you can't beat him. And David, what he does, he uses his testimony, his history of what he did, how he defeated the bear, how he defeated the lion, to bring Saul's faith up to where his is. And now Saul is an ally. Saul is not only willing to grant him the ability to go and fight, but now Saul is actually trying to help him to win the battle. And then we see here, that's where we're going to pick up in verse number 38. In verse 38, it says, "Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. David fastened on his sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them." So here we see that Saul now says, all right, David, you go fight him, and I'm going to help you fight him. I'm going to give you the weapons to go and fight with. And so Saul gives him a helmet. Saul gives him his armor. Saul gives him his sword. But the thing is, those are Saul's weapons. Those aren't David's weapons. And so Saul thinks he's trying to be helpful. And you've probably been in this situation, right? You had something that God gave you to do. You had something big to face, and you knew how you needed to attack it. But then somebody else comes along. Your pastor comes along. Your mother comes along. Your father comes along. A coworker, a boss comes along, and they say, no, this is the way to do it. No, you've got to learn not just to come, even if it's someone that's got authority, You've got to learn nobody has greater authority than God. So you've got to make sure that you take the weapons that God assigned you to take into that battle. Don't allow somebody else to push their weapons onto you. And we see that initially here, David actually takes them. David actually tries them on, but thank God that he was listening as he was walking around saying, no, these are not the weapons for me. And so he says to Saul, I cannot go in these, he said to Saul, because I am not used to them. These are not the weapons I trained with. I'm going into the biggest battle of my life. I've got to bring the weapons that I trained with. So he took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in his hand, approached the Philistine. So we see here that what David does is he takes those weapons. If we remember from lesson number 3, when we talked about, lesson number 2, when we talked about how you play, how you practice, David, when he was talking to Saul, said, when I was watching my father's sheep, yeah, that's when I defeated the bear. That's when I defeated the lion. So what does he do? He doesn't take the soldiers' weapons with him. He says, I'm a shepherd. I'm trained with the weapons of a shepherd. The sling, the staff, the pouch for me to keep the stones in. That's what I'm trained with. So you know what I'm doing? I'm taking off the weapons you're trying to push on me, and I'm going to pick up the weapons that I need. So on the way into battle, he makes sure that he gets these weapons, the ones that he trained with, the ones that God gave him to use against the bear, to use against the lion, the ones on which he built his faith by defeating these fierce enemies. So we see this is what happens here is David has gone and David has now picked up the appropriate weapons, the weapons that he trained with, so that he can go and face this formidable opponent that he has to face. And so the thing is, it looks here like, what are a couple of reasons why we often choose the wrong weapons when we go into battle? And here in this, we see really one of the biggest reasons why we take the wrong weapons. A lot of times we take the wrong weapons because we listen to the wrong person. We listen to what somebody else told us to take into battle with us instead of listening to what God told us to take into battle with us. But I want you to keep in mind these scriptures. When someone else is trying to get you to take another course, to take another approach to that formidable opponent you have in front of you, consider these words from the scriptures. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 27, God says, I will use the foolish things of the world to humble the wise, and I will use the weak things of the world to humble the strong. So we know that it's not always what it looks like in the world that matters. It's what God says that is going to be. But even if you go beyond that, you go to Isaiah 55, 8, and 9, it says, I love this, my thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways. And I love this. He goes on to say, it's not just that his thoughts are better than our thoughts either. It's not that most of the time he's right. He goes on to say, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. What does that mean? Every bit of the heavens is higher than every bit of the earth. If you take the highest point on the earth, you go to the top of Mount Everest, you still can't even touch the heavens. And that is how it is with man and with God. If we take our highest thought, if we take our most noble thought, if we took all the thoughts that every man could think, every bit of knowledge that every man had, we still wouldn't even be able to touch the heavens. We still wouldn't be able to touch God's thoughts, God's ways. So consider that. And we think about in 1 Samuel 16, when David's being brought before Samuel to get anointed, what does Samuel say? Samuel says, the man looks at the outward, but God looks at the heart. What does that mean? That means we're depending on, the man who's not spiritual is depending on his natural eyes. He's depending on what he hears with his ears. He's depending on his touch. He's depending on his fear a lot of times to make that decision. But he's not like God, because you know what? God does not just see with his natural eyes what's going on right there. Like we as people, we see see what we're in the middle of. We remember a little bit of our past, but God remembers all of our past. He knows what we're in the middle of, but most importantly, He knows what's coming down the line in the future. He knows why you've got to go through this battle. He knows why you've got to fight it the way you've got to fight it, because it's going to train you for even a greater victory down the line. So remember, when it comes to choosing those battles to go to war for those legendary victories, don't listen to what your cousin, to your friend, to your ride or die, or don't even listen to what your spouse says. Talk it out with them. Make sure they understand. Share their testimony with them. Share how you arrived at this decision with God. But make sure that you take the tools, the weapons that God gave you to go into the battle. So that's one of the things we've got to look out for, is that we've got to look out for listening to people rather than God when we choose the weapons. Because that's one way that frequently we take the wrong weapon into battle. Now there's another error that we make a lot of times. And a lot of times, where we make the error in choosing the wrong battle is that we identify the wrong enemy. It's easy for us with our natural eyes or our natural ears to see the coworker that's talking about you and think that's the enemy. It's easy when you've got a problem in your body, right? When you've got an illness that you've got a bad prognosis on, it's easy to see that illness as the issue. It's easy when there's a stack of bills. Trust me, I know this. It's easy when there's a stack of bills on the dresser and the bank account doesn't have enough to cover it to see those bills as the issue. But there are deeper things that go on behind the scenes that lead to these battles. And that's where if we start fighting that natural thing that we see in front of us, right? Now what happens, we get that prognosis, diabetes. The doctor says take a pill. So here you've got the two together. First of all, we've identified the wrong enemy, which we're calling diabetes, and now we're listening to that person of authority, the doctor, to take the pill. When really, had we gone to God in prayer, had we sought Him, God might have said, change your diet this way, add a little bit of exercise, and you can do it without all the side effects of that pill, without the dry mouth, without the constipation, without the possibility of all the things that come with these medications that we put in our bodies. And I'm not saying don't take the medication. I'm saying seek God before you choose that battle with which you that weapon that you choose to take into battle. And we see here, what do we mean by the fact that we identify the wrong enemy? Because if we look at Ephesians chapter 6, and we start with verse 12, it says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood." It's not against your coworker. It's not against your parents. It's not against your brother. It's not against your neighbor because his fence is on your property line. That's not where it's at. There are spiritual forces at work behind the scenes in all these things. It says, but it's against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly realms. So here we have, first of all, we've got to make sure that we're seeking God on what weapons to take into battle with us. Secondly, we've got to realize who the enemy is that we're fighting. Those forces that a lot of times are lying underneath the surface that are causing the problems in our lives. Diabetes is not the enemy. It's the way we've been eating. It's the way we've been living our lives that a lot of times is the enemy. So these things we've got to identify the proper enemy, and then we've got to seek God on what weapons we need to take into battle. And now here is where I began to struggle with this lesson a little bit. Because I couldn't think of, there's about 10, 15 minutes left. I couldn't think of 15 minutes worth of stuff to say, but because there was too much to say in order to get it in 15 minutes. I mean, God has been so good to us. He has given us so many weapons. He's given us more weapons than we probably even think of on a day-to-day basis to win these battles. I mean, if we look at Ephesians chapter 6, right after it talks about who the enemy is, It lists some weapons. It lists the belt of truth. It lists the breastplate of righteousness. It lists the sandals of peace. It lists the shield of the faith. It lists the helmet of salvation. It lists the sword of the Spirit. And a lot of times we stop there with the list. But God has given us even more weapons than that. He's given us prayer. He's given us praise. He's given us worship. He's given us fellowship. He's given us love to overcome the enemy with. He's given us service to overcome enemies with. So I'm not going to get into in detail all the weapons that we can bring to battle with us. We're going to go through very quickly here a little bit more of Ephesians chapter 6, where we discuss the armor of God. Look at that more on the big scope. And then what we're going to do is the next series we do after this one, we're going to study the weapons that God has given us. But first, I want to just introduce you to this armor of God and look at the big picture on how this works to protect us and why we need to bring them into battle. And some very important principles that we need to understand about our weapons. And it says in verse 13 of Ephesians chapter 6, it says, "Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand." Now this alone is deep, and we're going to touch on this because it says, "Therefore, put on the full armor of God." So this is what we've got to understand. We've got to put on the armor. God comes out and God lays the armor out before us. God has it all laid out, ready for us to put on. He has made it available to us. But if we don't do our part and pick up the armor and put it on, then it is of no effect. God has given us prayer. God has given His word in the Bible. God has given us praise and worship. God has given us teachers to teach us. God has given us tongues that can speak either life or death. So if we're not picking up the weapon, if we're not using it, if we're not training with it, and then if we're not taking the battles because we didn't pick it up and put it on. So remember that it says, put on the full armor of God. It doesn't say that the full armor of God is going to jump onto you. You've got to take that step and you've got to put it on. And then I love, because it goes on, not only do you have to put it on, but it goes on to say, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. So it doesn't say, notice it doesn't say, if the day of evil comes, you can stand your ground, right? So the day of evil is going to come. The day of the battle is going to come. What God is saying is you've got to not only put it on, but you've got to choose to put it on every single day because the battle is going to come. But you know what else He doesn't do? He doesn't say so that on June 14th, when the enemy comes, you'll be ready to go. It doesn't say that on October 5th, when the enemy comes, you'll be ready to go. We don't know when the enemy is going to come. So you can't just put it on one day. You've got to make the decision to put on the armor every day. Every day when you wake up in the morning, you've got to say, this could be the day I'm going to put on my armor, and I'm going to put on the whole armor of God. I'm not going to take one piece and not another. I'm going to take the whole armor of God. Now we're going to look at this. There's an interesting point too. I'm going to read through all the pieces, and I'm going to look at them as a unit rather than as each individual piece. As he goes on to say, says, "Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God." And when we're done this series, we're going to take a look at these item by item. But I just want to point out to you in this is that you notice the whole person is covered. It goes from the feet to the head. And that's what he's trying to tell us is, look, you've got to take this armor with you. You've got to take your weapons with you. You've got to be prepared for battle from your feet to your head. Now, from your feet to your head in your body is your whole body. But think about now, translate that to your whole life. Not only do you have to wear the armor of God, but you have to wear that armor of God in every aspect of your life. It's not a pick and choose. It's not an a la carte menu. You take the whole thing, right? So I can't say, all right, so I'm going to take my weapons with me when I'm in church, and I'm going to keep my weapons with me at home. But man, when I go to work, that's where I earn my living. I got to do what the boss says. I can't bring my spiritual weapons with me to work. No, you've got to take them. You've got to be covered in every area of your life. And I've used this analogy before, right? Think about if someone has a needle with a deadly virus in it. You're not going to say, okay, well, I'll take the deadly virus, but just put it in my right arm, right? Or my right arm, right? Because we know that once that virus gets inside the right arm, it's going to take over the body. And remember this, we talked about we're not fighting against flesh and blood, but we're fighting against spiritual forces. And in the same way, if we allow that devil into our work life, or no, I don't need to put on my armor in my social life because I'm going to relax. I don't want to think about religion and I don't want to think about God. I just want to go relax and forget about everything. Yeah, but if you let that devil into any area of your life, he's going to be like that virus that you tried to say, just put it in my right arm. He is going to kick down every door, and he is going to infect every area of your life until you repent, turn back, and say, give me that cure. I'm coming back to you, God. I'm ready. Repent and turn back. Because, man, I'm telling you, you can't just wear the armor in certain areas, in certain aspects of your life. You can't just take your spirit with you into certain areas. You've got to bring your faith with you. You've got to bring your testimony with you. You've got to bring your prayer and your praise with you everywhere you go in every aspect of your life. From your personal life, your relationships, your work, your family, everywhere you go, your recreation, you've got to be covered in all areas of your life. And that's what we've got to learn, right? So here we are, and I'm going to tell you one other thing. I'm going to just share a little common story where I see how, just because you may be wondering, well, how is it that people choose the wrong weapons? And I'm just going to share a little story with you here too, and not on any particular person. So if anybody knows anybody like this, I'm not talking about them. This is just a common way that I've seen, and it's a way that I myself have made the mistake of taking the wrong weapon into battle, right? Because you think about our finances, and we think of the finances, we think the world provides them sometimes. Because we're getting a check signed by somebody else, we forget that it's God that put us in the position to make that money. And I've seen so many people, and I have done it myself, where they come into church, I've come into church, and I've been broken. I've had issues. I've had things that I just couldn't defeat, things that I just couldn't conquer. And I dedicate myself to serving God, and I'm out at prayer meeting, and I'm out at service every Sunday, and I'm at Bible study. And then all of a sudden, something comes up, and all of a sudden an unexpected bill comes up for $1,000. I'm like, how am I going to do this? And now you know what I do? The first thing I do, what do? I listen to somebody else who says, well, I got this second job that you can have, but you know what? Now I'm so tired from the second job, I'm not praying the way I was before. I'm so busy at the second job. You know what? The second job is on Wednesday at 8 o'clock when I used to be at Bible study. Sorry, they need you to work this Sunday. And again, I want to make sure that you understand this. I'm not saying that overtime is never the right solution, but so many people I've seen where they allowed that issue and the way they attacked it with the job, instead of going to God first and asking God how to face that enemy, I've seen so many people who came in broken, were doing well, and then allowed themselves to get sucked back into that job to meet a bill. And they fall out of the church. They fall away from God. And I'd see them 6 months later, and they look worse than they did before they ever came in the church. Why? Because they didn't go into that battle, that crucial battle, with the weapons that God gave them. They went into it with what people told them to do. They went into it with what their natural eyes, what their reasoning told them to do. So just make sure that you're careful. Again, before, as you face that enemy, as we see David, right, what did he do? He was given an enemy to face, and he didn't take the weapons that a warrior should take. He's a shepherd. He took the weapons a shepherd should take into the battle. We are spiritual. We need to make sure that we're strong in those spiritual weapons and we bring them into every single battle that we go into. I feel like I was really intense tonight. I don't know. Maybe because I'm talking about we're actually approaching the battle now. But we've got to understand these things, right? Because if we're taking the wrong weapons into the battle, we're putting ourselves at a disadvantage. Now, instead of a swift, decisive victory, the way that we're going to see that David had it, what happens? We're battling, we're beat up, we're torn down, and we've got to recover now. Why? Because we chose the wrong weapons when we went into battle. So I just want to encourage you in this. Train with the weapons now. Get your habits of prayer, get your habits of praise, of service, of getting in God's word. Get these things now. And when the day of that big battle comes, don't put them down. That's when you need to pick them up all the more. I remember there was I forget the name, I forget who the preacher was, but I remember a preacher saying one time, he said, I make sure every day before I leave the house, I pray for at least an hour. And then he said, except on days when I know I don't have time, days when I know I got a busy schedule, days when I know I've got to face things that I don't want to, and I don't have the time, and I'm stressed and I'm pressured. He says, and then I pray 2 hours. So keep that in mind, that the time for the spiritual things, the time for turning to God is only greater when you're facing that formidable opponent. So don't leave those things behind when you head on to that battlefield. And I thank you for tuning in for this lesson. Truly, I feel blessed to have brought it to you. I pray that you were blessed by it. And I just want to remind you again that this is actually the 5th one in a series. So if you have not seen the first ones, you can catch the first 4 either on our Facebook page at Romans 8:28 Publishing. We also have our YouTube channel, which is at Romans 8:28 Publishing, and then the number 6. I guess 5 people before me had used Romans 8:28 Publishing, so it's at Romans 8:28 Publishing 6 on YouTube. And then we also have our website, which is Romans828publishing.com. And on that site, not only do you get these videos, but on that site, we also have other videos, short videos and long lessons like this that can encourage you and strengthen you as well as having some books on there that may encourage you and strengthen you as well. So I just want to make sure I look forward to seeing you all again. I thank you again for tuning into this. I pray you have a blessed day and get ready for that legendary victory.